The Apostle Paul was not a harsh and unforgiving man. He was neither intolerant nor was he self opinionated. I've heard of people who have read some of the statements that he wrote in his letters who have concluded that he was an unmarried woman hater. Now, to tell the truth, I wonder how they make these things up because it is nonsense. Indeed, in the passage that we're going to read today from 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, we get an insight into the kind of man that he really was. But I determined this with myself, that I would not come again to you in heaviness. For if I make you sorry, who is he then that maketh me glad, but the same which is made sorry by me? And I wrote this same unto you, lest when I came, I should have sorrow from them of whom I ought to rejoice, having confidence in you all, that my joy is the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote unto you with many tears, not that ye should be grieved, but that ye might know the love which I have more abundantly unto you. It's said that when we are under pressure, we automatically respond with our natural deep-seated response. We exhibit what we really are like. At other times, when we have time to measure ourselves, we can put on a facade. In the verses that we have just read, we have an insight into Paul's heart. He lays his soul bare for us to see. Now, the situation in Corinth weighed heavily upon Paul, and although he does not describe in any detail what the issue really was, we're just left to surmise. He gives us a sense of that burden in the words, I would not come again to you in heaviness, verse 1. Now, the idea in the word heaviness is one of sorrow or perhaps even distress. When things were not going well with God's people, he was concerned to the extent that I had no rest in my spirit, as he says later in verse 13. It is the mark of one who cares. Far too many of us do not have that deep spiritual interest in the welfare of God's people. Now, the issue was such that Paul could have gone to Corinth to deal with it personally with apostolic authority, as he describes in these words, shall I come to you with a rod, in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 21. That was never his first resort. Indeed, he indicates that when he wrote, to spare you I came not as yet unto Corinth, in chapter 1, verse 23. Instead, he wrote them a letter that we do not have. He says, I wrote this same unto you, in verse 3. And although it was possibly a severe letter, it was out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote unto you with many tears, as he says in verse 4. His hope was that by doing this, when eventually he did arrive in Corinth, he would not encounter an unresolved issue and have to deal with it with the apostolic rod. In that case, I should have sorrow from them of whom I ought to rejoice, he says in verse 3. Paul's approach was not designed to play down the sin, nor was it to avoid the issue as so often we would do. But it's rather that ye might know the love which I have more abundantly unto you, verse 4 again. Paul had a genuine care for these believers, and he knew what sometimes we forget, that if we're going to win people back, it will only be possible if, while dealing with their sin, we have showed them that we genuinely love and care for them. Paul believed that this would be easier by letter than by his presence, because he could reflect more carefully and thus respond more thoughtfully in a letter. Indeed, it might even have borne his tear stains. That is something for us to reflect upon when we see believers going astray. We must ensure that our actions are always motivated by real Christian love, as Paul's were.